definitely fun to be back home. This is a little bit of a departure from some of my usual work, which relates to information experiments, but we also have some work we've been doing lately on school choice. But this program takes place in the Palo Alto area, and came to know about it from attending the schools in the area here. Some background, maybe as graduate students and faculty can relate to this. I had this idea for this project sometime in my second or third year of graduate school, so I call up the program director of this desegregation program and say, hey, you've got this great natural experiment here. Maybe we could look at how this affects student outcomes. Any chance I can look at the data? And she replied quite flatly, no chance. Several years later, she retired, and I called back, and the replacement and the county superintendent said, sure, yeah, we can get those over to you. So now 7 or 8 years later down the line, finally get to look at some results. Today we're looking at college enrollment, but we're trying to expand the set of outcomes we're looking at here over time. So. All right. So as many of you know, de jure segregation started to be dismantled in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, but de facto segregation still persists. Just as one example, in 1968, 77% of black students, about 55% of Latino students attended schools that were more than half minority. In 2010, due to shifting demographics and a range of other reasons, that number is largely unchanged for black students and has increased to 80% for Latino students. And segregation is a concern because we see it's associated with a number of adverse outcomes. It's associated with higher rates of poverty, higher rates of crime. In the context of human capital development, we see that segregation is associated with differential access to school resources, peer quality, and lower performance as well. And this could be, these sort of differentials could be particularly concerning if they occur at early ages, which will be the context of the program I'll discuss in just a moment. Because as we know, skill production is a particularly sensitive time for skill production when children are young. So in this paper, I'll be asking, or trying to answer one part of the question: does access to low minority share, high resource school districts improve longer run outcomes, particularly in this presentation, college enrollment? And this can be a difficult question to answer because most school choice programs, most school integration programs tend to shift students between schools within a school district. But the largest determinant of segregation actually occurs across school districts. Moreover, it's also hard to find exogenous variation in access to low minority share schools for minority students. So the way that I try to go about answering this question is by studying this ongoing, I should say, a court-ordered desegregation program. It's actually due to a court settlement here right in the Bay Area. And what this program does is it allows rising kindergartners who are minority students in the Ravenswood School District, which is in the East Palo Alto area, allows those students to transfer across school districts at this early age. And from an identification standpoint, what's nice is that this offer is assigned by lottery. So it creates a good natural experiment. And today I'll be studying college enrollment. I actually have some very preliminary results on arrests, but I have to go through the county before I can discuss that stuff. Yeah, Eric? Extremely similar. When I presented this at the NBR, Josh Angra started calling it the Metco West program. So it's very similar. The difference, one difference is that Metco isn't done by lottery, so from a research standpoint, that's trickier. But it's actually, the Metco program's larger. There's also several other programs like this across the country. So I hesitate to say this is a common program, but there are a number of other states that have various forms of integration programs that might not be court mandated, but are aimed to reduce racial isolation. There's similar ones in Connecticut. St. Louis has a really big program right in that Normandy district around that area as well. So maybe not common, but not so unusual. Yeah. Great. Okay, so there's a number of papers that have studied aspects related to segregation in school outcomes, and this is complementary in some sense. So For instance, neighborhood and environment effects, I'll just highlight a few of these. There's research, obviously, on moving to opportunity, which focuses on an experiment that provided vouchers to low-income families to allow them to move to different neighborhoods in the experimental group, which targeted those vouchers to move to low-poverty census tract neighborhoods. And what was interesting is that in the experimental group, those vouchers did induce families to move to lower poverty neighborhoods, but the school characteristics associated with those neighborhoods didn't change nearly as substantially as the neighborhood characteristics. So they're still high minority share, relatively similar performance across the different groups here. In contrast, this study induces large changes in the characteristics of the schools that students are able to attend. But what's interesting is that to stay in the program, you actually have to remain in the sending district. So you have to remain in the Ravenswood School District throughout the time you're in the program. If you leave the district, you're removed from the program and you can no longer attend those schools unless, of course, you move from Ravenswood to, say, Palo Alto Unified next door. So it's sort of changing the schools, but relatively holding the neighborhood characteristics constant. And I should add that for the most part, the MTO experiment hasn't found substantial impacts on long-run education outcomes. There's the exception of the recent Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren and Larry Katz study, which found evidence of positive impacts if parents moved when their children were younger than 13. And the findings I have, would be consistent with sort of a similar story where the age could matter relative to other programs. There's also a really large school desegregation and resegregation literature. I won't talk too much about these. And they're very interesting research. John Gurian has a paper using time variation in the implementation of desegregation and busing programs to look at impacts on graduation rates and finds positive effects. Sarah Reber shows that changes in school resources might be driving some of these impacts. The one aspect that I will highlight is, interestingly enough, there were several randomized studies of school integration programs in the 60s. Thomas Cook has a review of these, and we're trying to track down some of the data and the papers associated with these. But in general, they found either very, very small or no impacts on short-run academic outcomes. But in contrast, I'll be focusing on longer-run college enrollment. In terms of programmatic similarities, Angrist and Lang, they studied the Boston Metco program. Because they didn't have data, apparently it's extremely difficult to get data on program participants in that program. They looked at the effect of the Metco program on the receiving students, and in general found small to null effects on the impact of receiving students in that program. Lastly, there's a number of interesting papers on school choice and high-quality charter schools on college enrollment. So there's the effects in the Boston charter schools showing predominantly that the charter schools in the Boston area can shift students from 2-year to 4-year college enrollment. Will Dobby, Roll, and Fryer have papers studying the Harlem Children's Zone and other schools as well, finding about a 5 percentage point intent to treat effect on college enrollment. Dave Deming and others looks at school choice in Charlotte-Mecklenburg County and also finds positive impacts if you get your first choice on college enrollment as well. Okay, so I'll give you a bit more about historical background about the program and discuss some of the relevant details in just a few slides, and then the data. The empirical strategy isn't as straightforward as one might imagine for a typical lottery program, actually. It's definitely taken a bit of time to sort it out, and then I'll discuss the main results on enrollment, some discussions of the limitations, and where we're trying to go in future work as well. And do feel free to stop me at any point here. So it turns out in the 60s and 70s, there was there were actually some racially motivated fights in the local high schools in Menlo Park area, and very contentious drawing of district boundaries. So apparently they managed to form a high school which coincidentally managed to contain every single African American in its catchment, leaving the completely sort of isolating in that respect. That high school has since been dissolved. But there was a class action lawsuit brought about by parents in 1976 saying that these school district boundaries had been illegally drawn to segregate students. And so they filed a suit against San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, and actually 8 school districts: Woodside, Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Las Lomitas, Belmont, San Carlos, Redwood City, which no longer participates in the program, and Portola Valley, I think is the last one. And this is still, but in 1986, 10 years later, they reached a settlement that mandated the creation of this transfer program. And the transfer program has the explicit goal, you can find this I think still on the Palo Alto Unified School District website describing the program, to reduce the racial isolation of students of color in the Palo Alto, Ravenswood, and other San Mateo County school districts. So this is a voluntary transfer program. So in contrast to these sort of large-scale busing programs, students, a small number of students apply to this program. You have to be a minority student living in the Ravenswood School District. There's mandated at least 166 slots per year, and the number of slots varies by school district. I'll show you exactly the minimum numbers by district in just a moment. They get about 220 applications per year. There's some variation year to year. Transfers are primarily eligible for kindergarten. There's a small number of slots available for first and second graders. After second grade, nobody is eligible to apply any longer. Interestingly, so if you win admission to the program, you can then continue through all the grades that district has to offer. So Palo Alto is the only district that goes K to 12. So if you win admission to Palo Alto Unified, you can then attend from kindergarten through 12th grade. Most of the other districts go through K through 8. Right? So, and if they lose admission, they're just remain through the Ravenswood school district system. So you must remain in the sending district throughout the program. They do provide free transportation. But that said, I think it'll be apparent from some of the descriptives that distance here is probably still a factor. Qualitatively, it doesn't seem like the transportation is always the nicest experience for these students either. In terms of funding, there's a 70-30 split. So 70% of the funding, if a student transfers, goes to the receiving district. 30% remains in the Ravenswood district for every student that transfers. And I think part of the idea is that there's a fixed cost to serving kids, so the Ravenswood district retains some of that funding. Yeah, please. How do they verify is an excellent question. My sense is that they don't, in a sense. I don't think they've had any serious issues with that I've heard about. They do have specific categories that they list on the website. Empirically, you see African American students, we see Hispanic students, and then the third largest share is Pacific Islander students, Asian Pacific Islander. But they sort of specifically list out the categories. I don't think there's much in the way of verification. What they do require verification for is where you live. You have to show some documentation that you live in the Ravenswood School District. Yeah. Good question. Oh, it's sort of like what share of a kindergarten class might this be, or something to that effect? I think I want to say there's roughly 600 odd students in a Ravenswood kindergarten cohort. So maybe roughly a third or so, if I were to hazard a guess there. Who apply? That's a good question. I think it's probably the vast majority. I couldn't tell you exactly off the top of my head. I can't remember. I'll show you some demographics of each school district, and so maybe we'll get a sense pretty well from that. It's essentially, for instance, that I think it's very low single digits of white students in the Ravenswood School District area. Actually, in theory, I should mention, just as a continuation of that point, students from these receiving districts can actually transfer to the Ravenswood district if they wish. I believe 2 students have done this in the 20 years that the program has existed. Great. Yeah, is there another question? Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. No, good. It's a good question. So I think and this goes back to sort of like parent. You'll see that the strategy they use to do the application process is a strategy-proof mechanism, but to the question of whether parents understand that might be different. So I actually have gone to San Mateo County several times to see exactly how they do this. It's pretty basic. They have like a FileMaker Pro software that they use, and they generate a program which sorts the students in the way they want, and then they allocate accordingly. So what I could do is then look at the application records, which is the data I have, and verify that they sort of follow this mechanism. And there are maybe it's single digits in where we see differences in what we would expect to see versus what actually happens. But I did want to actually get their sort of primary records to try and verify it to the best we can. We also spoke to the consultant who wrote the software for the program as well, and she went back in past years to verify the mechanism to make sure that it was doing what it's supposed to be doing, and she found similar things as well. Yeah. Good question. Okay. So as I mentioned, there's actually similar programs in other places, either interdistrict choice or with the explicit goal of integrating schools. All right, so I guess you guys don't really need to see a map of where you live. Often I have to point this out, but maybe one subtle point is that the Ravenswood School District boundaries don't exactly overlap with East Palo Alto. They also cover parts of East Menlo Park. But you'll see that the most popular districts in the choice set are Palo Alto Unified, followed by Menlo Park, which are immediately adjacent. Palo Alto Unified also has the advantage that they offer grades K through 12 in the program as well. Redwood City actually used to participate in this program a long time before the data that I have, but there's a stipulation that if the share minority in a district goes above 60%, they no longer have to participate. So Redwood City's demographics has changed over time, and they're no longer a part of the program. All right, so how does the assignment process work? This is actually really important because it directly affects the empirical strategy and complicates it to some degree. So the assignment system that they use is what's known in the choice literature as serial dictatorship. And what this means is that families rank their choices, and they're only eligible to receive admission to the districts that they write on the application. So if you only write Palo Alto and Menlo Park and you leave the rest blank, you're only going to be eligible to receive an offer to Palo Alto and Menlo Park. But you can fill out all 7, giving yourself a positive probability for all of those. You're then sorted, there's going to be priority groups, which are by sibling status. So if you have a sibling already in the district, they then give you priority to receive admission. So families are assigned a lottery number and allocated. So just to be specific about what happens, they receive the set of applications. They see their district choices for each of their 7 possible selections. They assign a lottery number. If you receive the first lottery number, you're number 1. They look at your choices and they say, oh, you listed Palo Alto as your first choice. Palo Alto hasn't exceeded its number of slots, so we're going to allocate you to Palo Alto. Then they move down to the second person. And they look at the second person's choice and say, oh, your first choice is Menlo Park. So Menlo Park hasn't filled up, we're going to allocate you there, and so on. Now, to get to a person whose lottery number is 170, they'll look at their choices and say, oh, you're Palo Alto. Well, we've already filled up the slots. Let's look at your second choice. Menlo Park, well, if that's full, they move to your third choice, and so on. So if they reach either to your 7th choice and there's still no slots, that means you don't get admission. Or if you haven't marked a 3rd or 4th slot, that means you won't receive an offer of admission either. So this is strategy-proof. In theory, they should be writing their choices in such a way that it reveals their true preferences, but that's conditional on parents understanding the program or believing the way that that it seems to work. That said, when you look at the strategy sets here, their set of choices, you'll see that they don't seem to be gaming the system in a way that could give them the highest likelihood of winning admission. So to be specific, here's their distribution of choices. So this is their first choice through their seventh choice. This is the mandated minimum number of slots that they have to offer each district. So you see Palo Alto offers the most slots, 60 students at least. And that's just determined, I think, by the size of the districts historically in the program. So it's Palo Alto followed by Menlo Park and San Carlos, or I guess Belmont and then San Carlos. And then here, this is the percent of students who choose each district as their first choice and their second choice and so on. So everybody chooses some first choice, right? Or else they wouldn't apply. We see the most popular, 2/3 choose Palo Alto as their first choice. And then the majority of people for their second choice choose Menlo Park. But what's interesting is that there's already almost 1/3 of families who only choose Palo Alto. And by the time we get to their third choice, more than half of the families aren't even entering a third choice. And 90% of the families don't select a seventh choice. So for the most part, if somebody, for instance, selects Belmont at some point in their choice set, they'd have a pretty high chance of winning admission to the program. And this combination of facts basically implies that what's largely going to be identified here is a Palo Alto effect for the most part, and to some extent Menlo Park. But the fact that most people choose Palo Alto and Menlo Park and the majority don't even bother choosing subsequent choices is just going to heavily weight it in that way. Yeah? Do they have that? Oh, you mean like sort of redoing their choice or saying? Oh, yeah, they can always, there is a share of people who win admission and don't go. So unfortunately, you'll see a big drawback to the data I have is I don't have enrollment records at the district level, but I have some aggregate statistics that I've obtained in recent years. And there's something in the single digits don't go on. So I think it's maybe 4%. And overall, I should say that there's roughly 4 to 6% attrition per year just looking at the aggregate statistics over time. And that actually means that by the time the cohort gets to 12th grade, there's a large share of students who are no longer 12th graders in Palo Alto High School. Yeah. Any other choices or questions? Great. Okay. All right, so I'm going to give you some breakdown of the district demographics here. Maybe you're already largely familiar with this, but this is based on data from the California Department of Ed in the year 2000, which is right around the time that the data that I'm looking at. So it's just one particular snapshot meant to just give you some idea of the differences across the districts. So Ravenswood has the second highest student-to-teacher ratio compared to these other districts. This is the share of students with special education status. Actually has among the lowest here, or among the lowest share of students classified as special education. But here we see some stark differences. So this is the share of students in the, this is in fifth grade of Ravenswood, of the fifth grade class, if I remember, from the California Department of Ed data. 65% of students have limited English proficiency, whereas in these other districts, and this is including the transfer students, it's all in the single digits, the share of students with limited English proficiency. In terms of per pupil spending, we see that the two largest districts here, largest receiving districts, Palo Alto and Menlo Park, have substantially larger per pupil spending 16 years ago, at least, almost 50, 60% larger. And then this is just looking at the absolute test score differences. So this is averaging their math and English percentile scores. These are district level scores just to give you a descriptive idea. And we see that, again, Palo Alto, Menlo Park are in the mid to upper 80s in terms of the percentile test scores, whereas Ravenswood is substantially lower than that. In terms of demographic information, so you see Ravenswood is less than 1% students are white, a quarter of students are Black, a very low share are Asian, and almost 2/3 of students are Hispanic. And this category is as categorized in the data, these Asian Pacific Islander students as well, who are also eligible for the program too. But we see for these other districts, the share of Black students in Belmont, Las Lomitas, Palo Alto Unified, and again, this is including transferring students, are all in the single digits. Similarly, for Hispanic students, relatively low share of students, Hispanic students in the receiving districts as well. But I mean, this is sort of interesting because it might mean that a large share of the students who are minorities could be coming from the transfer program itself. All right, some information about the households. So households in Ravenswood tend to be a good bit larger than households. This is from census data in the year 2000. Than households in the receiving districts. Median income is roughly half of median household income in Palo Alto Unified. Even more substantial differences depending on what district you're looking at. Families are nearly 5 times more likely to grow up these children are 5 times more likely to grow up in poverty relative to families in Palo Alto. And the share of parents who have no high school diploma in Ravenswood school districts is much larger as well. I mean, so the basic idea here, I mean, again, you might be largely familiar with this already, is that there's substantial differences. It fits this paradigm that across these district boundaries, there's large demographic differences both in the schools and in the households across these sending and receiving districts. All right, so what data do I have? You'll see there's some advantages and some distinct disadvantages to the data. So I got application data going back to 1998. These originally came in Excel spreadsheets, and then I went back to the county to discuss with them about actually getting the original data from their nice FileMaker Pro software as well. It has these application data have the name, birth date, the race, all their district preferences, and the lottery outcome as well. So we observe everything that the district observes. Unfortunately, there's no individual data on enrollment within a district, and in the particular data set that I have, there's no information on the student gender. So what we'll do is we'll infer this with the first name. So we have 3 raters look at the first names, rate male or female, and if there's agreement, we go with that code. If there's no agreement, we just put a dummy for missing. Some of the FileMaker Pro data actually has this in there, so we'll be able to add that as well. I'll just cut the data for now. For those who are age 16 and over, in the spring of 2015, you could certainly cut at a higher age, but there is some share of students who take it seems like they take part-time 1 or 2 college courses even at age 16. I should also add that students can apply more than once. So if they're not if they don't win enrollment in kindergarten, they can apply again in 1st grade. But not a large share do this, but you'll see we incorporate that in the analysis. So I'll take the name and birth date data, and I'll merge that to data from the National Student Clearinghouse, where we can get what college they attended, the length of enrollment, their enrollment status. I'll codify the selectivity of these schools as well, although you'll see that largely the schools they enroll are local community colleges, so there won't be much going on there. Yeah. Yeah. We did. So yeah, Tom Bailey mentioned this as well, because it would be really nice to know what high schools they went to. And at least what they told us was that data is not available for researchers. So maybe that will change at some point, but yeah, that would be nice to see. Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? Okay. So these are some summary statistics of the data that I have. Conditional on the way I've cut the sample, the average age is 20 years old, roughly 50-50 split share female. And the demographics here largely match what we saw previously. About a quarter of the sample is black, 60% or so are Hispanic, and 12% are this Asian Pacific Islander categorization. Some summary statistics on college enrollment. Again, this is conditional on being age 16 and up. About 39% have ever enrolled in college, and these indicators here are not mutually exclusive, but 17% have ever enrolled in 4-year, 31% have enrolled in a 2-year college at some point. I'm just going to define persistence as attending at least 2 semesters or more of college. Maybe as they get older, I'll be able to look at other longer run completion outcomes. Most students are attending public schools. Very few are attending quote unquote selective universities. We can also look at the share of students who are transferring, who attended a 2-year college first and then transferred to a 4-year college. And then the last point, which will be interesting when we look at heterogeneity and the effects here, is that the within sample gender enrollment gap is about 10 percentage points favoring female students. So female applicants are 10 percentage points more likely to attend some form of college. All right, so the empirical framework. This is, as I mentioned before, actually a bit trickier than a standard lottery estimation, because the issue is that not only does it matter whether you win admission, but it actually matters how you mark your preferences. So if you mark your preferences Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Belmont, you have a different chance of admission than if you mark your chances Menlo Park, Palo Alto, San Carlos. And of course, you know, there's at least 7 factorial possible choices they could make. So if we were to fully saturate the model, we'd have many more parameters than we actually have data points. So there's a couple of ways to approach this. For this presentation, I'll just be imposing some functional form assumptions on the framework here, and then looking at how robust it is to other choices. I'll also do some conditioning. So if given that most people choose Palo Alto and Menlo Park as their first choices, I can condition on that and then fully saturate the model as well and see how robust things are. So I'll start just by doing year, grade, fixed effects for all their preferences and their sibling status. This is basically the only control I have is their race and their number of times they've applied. And essentially what I do is just impose some separability on these. So we can interact various number of these variables to increase the flexibility of the functional form. The outcomes are going to be college enrollment, just indicators for ever attending a 2-year college, ever attending a 4-year college, whether it's public, private, an indicator for attending 2 semesters or more, the selectivity, whether they transferred, et cetera. Sorry for this typo here. We follow the charter school literature that clusters standard errors by the risk sets, so sort of the grade by year by choices. If we just use robust standard errors, then pretty similar as well. And I'll discuss some other alternative strategies we're working on later in the presentation. Okay, so we can check for balance at baseline, but I want to caveat this point with that we don't have a lot of baseline characteristics to go on. So even if we had test scores, that would be post-treatment in a sense. So what we do have is the data on the application we've got, which is age, gender, and race. At least among those variables, we don't see much differences by whether somebody wins an offer or loses an offer. And a joint test of regressing these statistics on the likelihood of winning an offer isn't significant. So that said, it's with that caveat that we don't have a lot of variables to start with. That's because we do have multiple applicants here. Yeah, so we do control for that. If we just go by whether as another robustness check, just taking the first time they apply and going with that, it's largely the same. There's not a huge number, but it does increase, yeah. Is there one other point here? No, okay. All right, and here's the first set of effects here. So here we've got any college enrollment, whether they attend at any point a 2-year college, at any point a 4-year college, whether it's public, private, and then this persistence outcome. And you see that the effects of receiving an offer, I should add, these are all intent to treat effects because I don't have the data on enrollment. We see that winning an offer increases the likelihood they go to either a 2-year or 4-year college by 9 percentage points. And the share of people, the baseline for college attendance was again in that 40% range. So it's a pretty substantial increase. Largely this is for 2-year colleges, about 8 percentage points. Very few students going to 4-year colleges. Overwhelmingly that are public, almost no effect on private colleges, and we do see positive effects on persistence. Seems like most people who do attend persist at least 2 semesters here. Adding controls, maybe just because we don't have a lot of controls to add, doesn't seem to change the effects in any way. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll just show you results with controls. Yeah? Yeah. So roughly, there's the 4 to 6% attrition per year is what seems to happen. Yeah, even that. So actually, it's nice. In the first year, they break it out a little bit more. And again, I think they did this for the year 2012. So it's just suggestive of what might have happened at the time this program was in place. So I think they break it out by those who left in the middle of the semester, by those who just never showed up. I can't remember what the exact breakdowns are, but that part is in the paper, at least for that particular year. But I just remember overall it's in like the 4 to 6% range each year. Don't show up the following year. Yeah. Okay. What's particularly interesting though is that there's substantial heterogeneity in the effects here. So I'm just going to cut the sample, but we could do the interaction terms as well. There are qualitatively larger effects for black students who win an offer of admission to the program. We see a 15 percentage point effect, marginally significant. And again, same sort of pattern, largely driven by 2-year college attendance and public school attendance, with no real effect on attending 4-year colleges, and just a noisy effect here of attending a private college. Because most of the remaining sample is Hispanic, that means that the effects tend to be much smaller for Hispanic students as compared to black students. So smaller and not statistically significant, 6 percentage points, and same sort of pattern though with qualitatively larger point estimates on 2-year college attendance and public college attendance as well. Yeah, this, if we do an interaction, I'm trying to remember if the interaction, just doing offer interacted with black, was statistically different from each other. It was pretty marginal. So I'd say the p-value is between 0.1 and 0.2. One thing we'll be able to do is that each year we get another cohort who we can merge to the data. So definitely hoping to do that as time goes on, and maybe we'll get some more precision, because it would be nice to say more definitively if these differences are statistically true. Yeah. Okay, so. All right, the other point of significant heterogeneity as well is by male and female students. And this difference is certainly statistically significant. So basically no effect for female students on the likelihood of attending either 2-year or 4-year college. Actually a negative coefficient on the likelihood of attending any 4-year college, but not statistically significant. Some other negative but not significant coefficients here on attending a private school or their persistence as well. But very large and significant effects for male students of attending any college, quite similar to those for black students as well. Again, driven by 2-year colleges, public colleges, but here the effects are large enough that we see a positive effect on private school attendance and large effects for persistence as well. This is interesting because I can't really figure out a rhyme or reason for the heterogeneity in gender in education interventions. It seems like for college attendance, it can go back and forth. I know, I think in the program that was run, an intervention designed to get students to enroll in college by Bruce Sacerdote and I think it's Scott Carroll, found large effects for female students and not significant effects for male students, at least in the version of the paper that I remember. In the charter school literature, there seems to actually be maybe slightly larger effects in college enrollment for male students, but certainly not statistically different. And in the school choice literature, or school choice paper that Dave Deming, Justine Hastings worked on in Charlotte-Mecklenburg County, they found larger effects for female students, I believe, in that program. And here it's for male students. In the Moving to Opportunity program, they seem to find, again, there's no substantial differences in effects on college enrollment, but they did seem to find effects on other outcomes that were positive for female students, and if anything, negative effects for male students, particularly mental health related outcomes. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think, so there was one working hypothesis I had, which again would be completely speculative, but it could be that parents who are applying to this program, given that these results are all conditional on application, it could be that the male students might be perhaps more at risk in the counterfactual than the female students. So, if we think that some of the crime or whatever other at-risk activities might occur in their schools in Ravenswood, male students seem to have those behavior issues more prevalently. Perhaps there's greater gains to be had for male students if they're admitted to the program. College enrollment is at baseline lower for male students, so maybe there's more clawback, but it is a bit speculative, at least what I've thought of so far. The closest empirical test I've been working on, which I'm not sure if there's sufficient power to do this yet, is we do have, there are kind of transfer cohorts here. So in a given year, some students transfer to a given district. So we've got 7 possible districts in each year. And there is sometimes, there's a decent amount of random variation in who wins admission and the demographic characteristics of those students. So maybe the share Hispanic or the share male, the share female varies a little bit. And maybe that those shares might impact outcomes, but it might be asking a lot of the data. So we'll see if we can find anything on that front. But I think that's an interesting idea about the peer quality. Actually, I mean, the other hypothesis for these college enrollment effects is just that, is peer quality, is that there's a much more substantial college-going culture in these schools to begin with. This wouldn't explain necessarily the gender heterogeneity, but that's why you might see, given the literature showing small impacts on test scores in the past, we might see just going to 2-year colleges, which aren't selective, but if there's the college guidance counselors are strongly encouraging people to attend college, maybe this is the margin that it can operate on. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. That's a good point. Okay, in terms of college selectivity, I mean, this are basically zeros across the board, just given what we've seen, that most students are attending 2-year colleges, so I won't spend too much time on this, but it's basically small coefficients. There's some element, we saw several negative coefficients before. That's a little bit of a theme here with this selectivity, but I don't think we can read too much into this, given that most of these coefficients aren't significant to begin with. So some robustness checks, and I'll talk a bit more about an alternative estimation strategy we're working on. So the baseline specification I have was a full interaction of year with the first choices that students make. We then separately enter in remaining choices, the grade level, and their sibling status as well. So that's what I've been showing you. We can also just exclude siblings entirely, which most of the time, if you have a sibling in the program, you're highly likely to win admission. We can do the sibling interactions. We can do everything separable with no interactions. Then we can do all choices interactive with year effects. And then this is kind of the most stringent test, which is we can saturate the model in your first choice, grade, and year, and then condition your second choice on being Palo Alto and Menlo Park, and that your third choice, you don't make, you leave it blank. And this still covers a fair amount of the sample. But we get closer to saturating the model. I'll say the last choice we've been working on now, which is a nice way of collapsing the dimensionality and goes back to checking the sort of fidelity of the lottery itself, is to just simulate the lottery. So in theory, we can, if we have all their preferences, we can just replicate the lottery several thousand times, generate probabilities of receiving admission, and just control directly for those probabilities. We'll see how well we can do that, given we've got to look really closely at all the application data and such. Okay, so this is the base specification you've seen before. If we drop siblings, not a lot of change. Same with the sibling interaction effect. If we do everything with just separable controls, a slightly smaller point estimate, this is just interacting each district choice with the year of application, and then actually slightly larger effects when we cut the sample here by these selections here and fully saturate the model. So this just gives at least somewhat of a range of potential estimates here. But again, overall, pretty decent sized, significant effects. Okay. All right, so one other question is just to get at what we're identifying here, and just to reinforce the point that this is largely kind of a Palo Alto effect. Some sample size numbers I forgot to change here. But this is just the interaction of the effect of receiving an offer and receiving an offer and it being Palo Alto. And we see that, again, largely the effect of receiving an offer and it being Palo Alto sums to pretty much the same as the effect I showed you before. Just kind of indicative that just looking at the Palo Alto effect is quite similar. If we do try to really stretch the data and identify individual district effects, I find these pretty implausible because the sample sizes get so small. Again, you see the Palo Alto effect up there. Woodside is this outlandishly large effect. It's also one of the smallest receiving districts. Portola Valley has a strong negative effect. It's also the second or third smallest receiving district. So, this is more to just point out that I think largely what's being identified here is this Palo Alto effect. Another question I've received is just, is there any effect of getting your first or second choice relative to the overall impact, and no real differential effects, especially not surprising given that most people only mark their first or second choices, and 56% don't even mark a third choice. And sometimes this question arises. Okay, so I'll give some discussion and sort of where we're trying to get to next. So there are some substantially heterogeneous impacts here on overall college enrollment. I think this is different than what we've seen in the charter school literature and some of the school choice literature in terms of the magnitude of that gender heterogeneity. In contrast to some of the charter school work, which shows people shifting from 2-year colleges to 4-year colleges, all the effect here seems to be driven by 2-year college enrollment. And so, that's really the margin of action here. There are some, in terms of limitations, I think Palo Alto is an extremely unique environment. I mean, I do think there are other places where you see stark contrast between wealthy and lower income districts side by side. But of course, Palo Alto is, it's the one place where they have like a $3 million media center that James Franco does mural drawings on or something like that. So, it is somewhat unique in that sense. It's also conditional on the parents who apply. So much like the charter school literature, it's a little bit hard to say if we just took anybody in the Ravenswood School District and entered into this program, whether we would see similar effects. The other side is that it is hard to identify the mechanisms given the data that I have so far. So I think some of the literature, like Rucker-Johnson, discusses 3 possible mechanisms of school resources and peer quality and higher expectations. And I think in the descriptive data, we do see that Palo Alto Unified and Menlo Park are spending a lot more per pupil. But I think definitely the peer quality matters here in a couple of respects. In just sort of reading interviews with students that you can find in newspapers over time in the area, they do discuss, for instance, one student saying, I enrolled in such and such college because my college guidance counselor, we had several alumni in this college, so I could go talk to them and actually hear about their experience in the university. And maybe that's less of a plausible mechanism, or that's less likely to happen in the Ravenwood School District if fewer students are going on to college. The other aspect about higher expectations, there's some work by a sociology student who used to be here at Stanford who's studied this program as well, Kendra Bischoff, who did some interviews with students, and they did say that there was this feeling that students felt that there was higher expectations, that they felt like they were in this, they were kind of this privileged higher I hesitate to say, higher class of study relative to what they might have been. And maybe that sort of fueled their motivation as well. It is quite tricky, unfortunately, to get short-run academic outcomes, so I have been working on this, but I really want to do this at the state level because the mobility of students who might not have won admission, it tends to scatter across a number of districts outside of the 8 participating districts. So I'm very concerned about even just trying to enter the MOU process with the ones that do participate. Unfortunately, it's been really hard to get state-level data or data from the state to do that sort of analysis. But it took 7 or 8 years to get this far. So what's another? Maybe the state superintendent will retire at some point too. What we've been working on now is, let's see if it's here, is to examine arrest records. And this might be of interest to students here because I'm hoping to make this data set more widely available. So I was interested in, I was talking to Dave Deming, who said, if you see this large effect on male students that is particularly at risk, maybe you'd see some impacts on arrests. So I was trying to rack my brain about where we might find arrest records. And I like to go visit SF Gate to keep track of what's going on with the Warriors and the Giants. They also list who's been arrested each week on their newspaper and their webpage. So I called them up, say, where do you get their data? And they go to this guy in Sacramento who's a former law enforcement official who's entered into agreements or FOIA'd law enforcement agencies across the state of California. And he now has arrest records he sells to papers and other places for all but 3 counties in the state. And the 3 that aren't in the data are somewhere up by Eureka for the most part. So in the arrest record data, they have name, birth date, what the arrest code was, and what agency made the arrest. So they've matched the data that I have to their data on arrests, so we can start looking at those outcomes. Qualitatively, we'll see what's going on. Right now they're doing an exact match, so we've invested some money to do a fuzzy matching process so we can analyze those outcomes. But one of the selling points I made to this person is that other researchers might be interested in it. So if we get it off the ground, I would love to see more people use the data. We also received 2012 voting records for everybody in the state of California, which have name and birth date. So we're going to merge to those data, see if there's any effect on whether they register or vote. And then we've been working on this alternative estimation strategies to see if we have enough information where we can simulate this lottery process just as another robustness check as well. And then each year we'll get sort of another cohort who might be eligible to apply for college. So we'll go back and remerge the data as well.